Today is June 21st, 2023, and my guest is neuroscientist and author Erik Hoel. You can find his essays on Substack at The Intrinsic Perspective. They're fantastic. His latest book, and the subject of today's conversation, is The World Behind the World, Consciousness, Free Will, and the Limits of Science. This is Erik's third appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in April of 2023 talking about the threat to humanity from artificial intelligence. Erik, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be back on here, Russ.
Now, you start your book discussing a really fascinating thesis about our self-knowledge as a species, which is a topic I've never thought about. Like, how do we know about ourselves, and when did that start? When did that begin? But this thesis comes from Julian Jaynes in a book that came out in 1976, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. What was Jaynes's idea?
Yeah, James's idea was that if you went back and you looked at very early historical texts, particularly for him, the Iliad, the way that characters talk about their own minds and their own drives is extremely unusual, or you might say not at all modern. And an example would be that they're constantly sort of driven by the will of the gods, and they don't seem to have much emotional understanding of their own selves. And he thought that sort of a very interesting interpretation of this would be that it's really that they actually are hearing, say, the commandments of the gods when they go to do actions. But what's actually going on, given what we know about the specialization between the hemispheres of the brain, is that essentially one side of the brain, one hemisphere of the brain, is really communicating to the other. And full human consciousness had not really been established at that time. And he marshals what's actually quite an impressive array of textual evidence. And the book itself is very sort of well written. It's a cult classic. I read it when I was young. It was one of the things that got me into consciousness research as a science. But it was always a bit of a wild theory, right? It was always extremely evocative, and it had all sorts of counterintuitive implications. For example, he thought that consciousness would therefore necessarily require language. And so he sort of had to be like Descartes, where he thought that all animals were automata. And there's all sorts of sort of counterintuitive outcomes of this. And I think as a whole, the book has like a really interesting place in the intellectual development of thinking about consciousness, because a lot of people have read it and enjoyed it, but a lot of people have also pointed out this critical fact that, beyond that textual evidence, we just don't have a huge amount of evidence, or really any evidence, that human consciousness sprung, into existence right during the Homeric ages.
But the reason I think it's interesting is it forces you, and the reason I like that it's how you open your book, is it forces you to think about the fact that the way we think about the world as moderns in 2023 is not the same. Now, it's an extreme claim that they didn't think about it at all at the time that the Iliad was written, but the idea that how we see ourselves, our role in the world, our place in the cosmos is not a constant. And it's hard to remember that. And it's particularly important when we go back to works of art like the Iliad or the Bible or even in the Middle Ages, that it's not consumed in the same way as we consume it today. And so I want you to react to that, but also talk about a lot of people challenged Jaynes's thesis by saying, well, wait a minute, what about this old poem? It looks pretty self-reflective. It looks pretty much like people were aware they had emotions and drives and urges. And how could he claim that this isn't true? And I think the very way he defends it also forces you to think about this evolution in our self-awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. So he has a very sort of clever defense against this. And first, let's just go over briefly some of the criticisms at the time. There was a philosopher, Ned Block, who's probably one of the most prominent current analytic philosophers of mind. He's at NYU. He's still, his he's sort of one of the last greats, I think, of late 20th century analytic philosophy. And back when Jaynes's book first came out, he wrote a review in the Boston Globe, immediately pointing out Jaynes seems to have confused something here, which is that it's not necessarily the case that the ancients had minds that were themselves incredibly different. It's maybe that the understanding that they had of those minds is what is so different, right? So they had like a very different interpretation. And Jaynes does have a pretty clever defense against this, and that's that translation, particularly modern translation, often reads in more of what I call the intrinsic perspective, which is sort of the view you can take of individuals that examines like the depth of their mind, the richness of their interiority. When we talk about minds, we're using the intrinsic perspective, and there's just and Jaynes points out that while you can find some instances of that, some of it is probably just added in to make the translations more literary and more modern. And I actually have an example here, and that's from a poem from a series called The Beginnings of Songs of Delight. It's housed at the British Museum. This is from about 1300 BC, so this is extremely old, and it's a call and response between a male and a female. The poem, so which is a very contemporary technique, and it was actually read at my wedding, and I'll just read it very briefly. And thou art to me as the garden which I planted with flowers and sweet smelling herbs. I directed a canal into it that thou might dippeth thy hand into it when the north wind blows cool. The beautiful place where we take a walk, where thy hand rests in mine, with thoughtful mind and joyous heart, because we walk together. So that's a very contemporary love poem, right? You might think, okay, the fact that someone in 1300 BC is writing this is sort of disproof of Jaynes's point.
Not just because it's a love poem, but because it has this rich metaphor and right.
Exactly. It has, it almost like thou art to me as a garden implies an internal topography, right? So it's like, well, you're really talking about the richness of someone's mind. And it's funny because when I was researching this book, I found another example of a translation of this poem that is not quite as nice for a wedding, right? So this is a different translation about 100 years later. That not the poem itself, the translation is a more modern translation. So it starts with, "I belong to you like this plot of ground that I planted with flowers and sweet smelling herbs. Sweet is its stream, dug by your hand, refreshing in the north wind. A lovely place to wander in, your hand in my hand, my body thrives, my heart exults at our walking together." It's still okay, but it's not quite as nice for a wedding, right? This like, I belong to you like this plot of ground. It makes it clear the analogy is really sort of extremely physical and materialistic. And even things like my heart exalts, are they thinking about heart as the physical heart, or are they thinking about it as the mental heart, right? Like it's unclear. And that's an example of the translations is this art form, and it's very difficult to figure out exactly what these ancients thought about minds.
I'm sure there's more than one PhD thesis on comparing, say, translations of the Iliad from Pope in, I think, the 18th century Pope. I'm pretty sure. I think that's right. Versus Fegel's in the 20th century or early 21st. Can't remember, but recently. And it's not just that, it's a, quote, better translation, that we know more about what those words mean now. It's that it's written for a different type of head, a 2023 head instead of a 1723 head. And that is, when you start to think about that, it's kind of mind expanding. And there's a wonderful book by George Steiner called After Babel, where he opens the book with he opens with Shakespeare, I think. And he says, can you understand this? And the answer is, well, some of the words are archaic and we don't know what they mean now, but we can look them up. But he makes the point that it's so much more than that. It's that many of the words that we know now didn't mean then what they mean now. And it's almost, you need multiple translations, and he then brings it forward to a passage from Jane Austen, then a passage from Noel Coward. And he shows you that even Noel Coward is writing the early part of the 20th century. He's referencing linguistically, not events that we don't remember, but usages that have changed. And language is dynamic. And that's in English. This is not translation. It's just understanding. And his theme, of course, is that everything's translation. All language is translation. When you're talking in English to a contemporary. And it's a brilliant and deep idea that kind of haunts me. And your example, Jane's examples, and your discussion of it at your wedding forces you to remember that language is so complex. It is so extraordinary.
And it's not even it's definitely language, and it's also the concepts behind the language that we have now. And that's actually a big part of this book, of my book, which is saying that, listen, we've made everyone acknowledges, it's a story incredibly well told, that we've made a huge amount of progress as a civilization in developing the scientific worldview, right? And the scientific worldview, traditionally views everything as extrinsic and materialistic. By extrinsic, I mean sort of like an engineering diagram. That would be something that's extrinsic. When you think about your car's engine, you're thinking extrinsically about your car's engine. You're thinking about all the different parts and their causal relationships, right? And everyone knows that we've gotten a lot better at understanding that side of the world. But we've also gotten better at understanding consciousness and minds. And that's very obvious if you go back and you look at these early texts. I mean, I do think that this is what Julian Jaynes is picking up on, that there just aren't, go find strong emotional reactions in really ancient literature. It's extraordinarily difficult. And then when you do, it's often then a debatable sort of subject of translation. They just don't have a rich language for describing minds. And an example that I give in the book is that there's this one of the sort of the oldest tales that we have, called The Story of the Shipwrecked Sailor, which goes back to around 2000 BC. And of course, this story of a sailor who gets shipwrecked on an island with a monster crops up again and again across human history. It's sort of a tale that's retold. So you can sort of look at this one tale and see, well, how is it told in ancient Egypt? How is it told in ancient Greece? And then how is it told now? Right. And in the ancient Egyptian one, the character is confronted by this snake that's, incredibly huge and long and has a beard and rears up over him with gem-like eyes. Right. And, there's just nothing about his emotional reaction to this creature. It's just like, oh, I saw this, this huge snake. Right. They either didn't have a great way of communicating that, terror or something, or they just didn't feel it was really worth noting, in their stories. But either way, they just don't seem like they have this really well developed. And if you go over to the Odyssey, which is basically, the same tale where they land and there's the Cyclops and they have to sort of confront the Cyclops, already there, the terror of the men at encountering the Cyclops is clearly mentioned, although it's not really dwelled upon. And then you can go, to a really modernized version of that, which is James Joyce's Ulysses, right? Which is technically, a retelling of the Odyssey. So sort of the same events occur in this highly literary way. And, the equivalent passage in James Joyce's Ulysses is just a guy going into a pub and seeing, kind of this giant with an eye patch who he's going to end up, getting some drinks with and sort of getting into a political argument with. And he sees a dog and he has this sort of, which is sort of the monster. And he sort of has this, pretty emotional reaction of oh, I hate this dog. I'm scared of this dog. This dog makes me nervous, and so on. And that transition really highlights how much more well-developed we are at telling stories about minds, where we can take even this really inconsequential event, just going to a bar, and fill it with all sorts of fantastical wonder. And when you actually meet the huge bearded serpent, there's just nothing when you go back, and look at ancient Egyptian literature.
Well, the power of this is that the causation for me is that the causation runs in both directions. I don't know if you agree with that, but I think you do. We human beings didn't have language by definition for every emotion or the subtleties of various emotions, the nuances in ancient times. And modern literature, which you reference very thoughtfully, helped develop our understanding of ourselves and used words in ways that hadn't been used before, which helped us understand how we were feeling. At the same time, how we were feeling and our awareness that we had different kinds of feelings encouraged us to develop those words. So I'll read a paragraph from the book, which I loved. And just to be clear, going forward in our conversation, the intrinsic perspective is the things going on the inside of us. The extrinsic perspective is the material world outside of us. And that's the contrast that you talk about a lot in the book. But here's the paragraph. While the richness of our consciousness, what it is like to be us, overflows our ability to express it, we have a language around consciousness that allows us to fluently talk about minds. We regularly refer to thoughts, feelings, memories, inclinations, emotions, sensations, perceptions, confusions, illusions. These are not just the building blocks of our daily lives and the minutiae of our streams of consciousness, but also the material out of which the greatest artists and writers make their art. A modern human is fluent in these concepts, able to deploy them to discuss their friends, their family, their enemies, themselves. End of quote. And of course, I would argue that to some extent, poetry, which you don't reference much in the book, poetry is the way we express things that we don't always have words for.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that a great deal. I think one of the things I wanted to get across when I was, discussing this development of the intrinsic perspective, a lot of which I think occurs in literature, is precisely this point you made earlier, wherein we now have concepts about ourselves, concepts of character development, concepts of emotionality that allow us to so fluently talk about minds. And it's not like a coincidence that we have those. Those were built. So there's, just in the same way that science had to develop all sorts of concepts like, mathematics and causal relationships and so on, and developing these concepts enriched our understanding of the extrinsic world. So we had to develop a huge number of sort of cognitive concepts, and that enriched our understanding of the intrinsic world. And one of the reasons that minds get portrayed so much more richly in contemporary literature, or by the time you get to the Enlightenment and some of the first early modern novels, is because those concepts had been introduced. And it's difficult to sort of go back and imagine what it would be like to not have a bunch of understanding of exactly how minds work, which we all sort of very naturally have and possess now, and then go write about minds, very early on in history before some of those concepts are around.
All right, here's another paragraph you write that I really like a lot. You say, rather, the mature intrinsic and extrinsic perspectives had to be constructed, sometimes laboriously, over millennia. It would take two discoveries, that of literature and that of science, to mature them fully. Humanity started off instead with merely a baseline view on the universe, consisting of whatever was useful to hunter-gatherers. It was the naive perspective of primates, who cared only about using tools for personal advantage and about manipulating social hierarchies, and that's about it. So it's a civilizational achievement to be able to extrinsically see the universe from the outside. It is also a civilizational achievement to be able to intrinsically see the universe from the inside. The two perspectives are the sources of our greatest triumphs, like our ability to observe galaxies light years away, and also the elegance and beauty of the stories we tell.
And I think what was interesting to me, and what I didn't really quite understand when I started researching this book and taking this sort of, this is sort of extremely big history, right? I mean, is extraordinarily, I'm talking about entire, millennia in like one chapter, right? So, admittedly, this is and the historical part is really just the first part of the book, but and so I fully sort of admit that. But one thing that I did not expect was that I think in general, there's a pattern wherein both perspectives leap forward at the same times in history. So everyone knows that science is developing in ancient Greek, but literature is also developing, in ancient Greece at around the same time. And you have the first sort of plays and the first in-depth description of characters. Medea was called one of the first real modern characters in literature, right? And these early plays, these are all sort of occurring around the same time, and I think that this is sort of like a general pattern. If you and it keeps repeating, like even up into the 1900s. Einstein introduces his sort of geometrical perspective of space-time in 1905. And Picasso generates Cubism in 1907. And both of them were sort of supposedly influenced by this book by Henri Poincaré called Science and Hypothesis, in which it talks about how to draw and understand the fourth dimension. And so for Einstein, of course, the fourth dimension ends up being time. That's how he interprets it. But for Picasso, he's so interested in this because he's like, well, I want to draw it from all dimensions, right? And like, what is Cubism but a view from sort of this out of time layered perspective? And so Picasso was sort of paying attention to the science of the day, and so I think you sort of see this concurrency, right, where they both jump forward. These two perspectives on the world jump forward at around the same times, and then often in the same places historically.
So I'm going to try something insane about economics. You can take it or leave it. We'll see how it goes. I just thought of it, so we'll see what comes out. I have, as a young economist, and I think most economists still today, are very focused on the material. They focus on what is the extrinsic perspective: standard of living, command over goods and services, wealth, stuff. And GDP is just dollar-denominated or currency-denominated measure of stuff, of goods and services, as a measure of the productivity of the economy. And a lot of people don't like economics, and they make the point, yeah, but there's things besides stuff. We don't just care about stuff. And economists, oh, of course you're right. And they yeah. But what's the problem is that, for me, in my view of this, is that economists certainly will concede that there are things other than stuff, but they have trouble incorporating the non-stuff stuff into their math. So they kind of just say, well, that's something else. Like, so for example, the despair of losing your job. And most economists are not going to focus on that. They're going to focus on the fact that, your material well-being will take a dip downward. If you have savings, you can insulate yourself, insure yourself against some of that. You might have friends you can rely on and so on. But the despair part, or the fact that you don't feel like you have a meaningful life because you're unemployed, that you've let down your family, say, that's not in there. That's for other fields. And I think that's a fundamental misreading of the human condition. It's the biggest shortcoming of economics. And I think the scientist can make the same point about your pairing the intrinsic and extrinsic perspective. They'd say, okay, yeah, sure, there's literature and there's advances in our understanding of ourselves, the different words, and that's lovely. Or Picasso, that's lovely, but come on, that's not real. The real stuff is we understand now about the redshift, and we understand now about how to make a computer and a cell phone and a car, an internal combustion engine, and a steam engine and a train. And those are the achievements of humankind. That's that other thing you're talking about, the intrinsic perspective. That's just what goes on in our heads. That's not important. That's not even real. It's just a bunch of well, chin music if you were a Woody Allen fan or somebody. I don't know where it's an old Yiddish thing kind of thing. It's just nonsense. It's fluff. It's not important. We shouldn't even be studying that. We shouldn't even be thinking about it. And the humanist responds, and I know you have both sides of your brain active because you wrote a novel. The humanist says, well, no, wait a minute. If you really have a ton of stuff and you can fly to any part of the world, but your life doesn't have any meaning, that inner part of you that's nagging at you about the meaningless of your life actually might be more important. So react to that.
Well, I think it's certainly a point that gets made, particularly the skeptical side of, well, why even talk about this sort of thing? But if you look historically, science focuses primarily on the extrinsic because it was decided that would be the case. So Galilei, he was one of the first people to really sort of officially say this, but he says, and this is right when science is getting established, and they have this problem of like, where do you put the soul in science? And the solution that all these people effectively accepted was that, well, let's just bracket that problem aside. So all these sort of qualities, like, which now we might use the term experiential qualities. So things like, the redness of red, or how beautiful a sunset looks, or all these things. He said, listen, we'll just take all that out, and we'll bracket it aside, and we'll just focus on, what the rays of light as the sun sets, right? And this is saying that science should be basically committed to the extrinsic perspective solely. And so he thinks, and that's why science is in the language of mathematics. And he thought science should focus on essentially a small number of properties of matter, like size, shape, location, right? This is like the billiard ball view of the universe. And that was massively historically successful, right? I mean, that bracketing aside, where it said, well, let's just not really worry about this half of the world, the extrinsic half of the world, minds, we'll just put that aside. And the problem is that, of course, human beings have physical brains. And at some point, scientists began to think, well, I want to know how the brain itself works, right? So they start to apply this extrinsic sort of thinking to the brain. And that's how you get contemporary neuroscience. But if you could somehow, Philip Goff who's a contemporary philosopher, makes this point in one of his books, but if you could somehow bring back Galileo to the current age and show him contemporary neuroscience, which is trying to, figure out how you generate, how consciousness occurs from like firings of neurons, he would probably say, well, wait a minute, what are you doing? I mean, the whole point of how I design science is that it's only supposed to deal with physical quantities. It's not supposed to deal with the qualities of your mind. This was a purposeful choice that allowed us to proceed. And what I've always been interested in, and what this book is sort of ultimately about, is the paradoxes that occur when you do try to fundamentally merge these two perspectives, right? We have this really well-developed perspective of how minds work, and we have this really well-developed perspective of how the physical world works. And then what is neuroscience? Current contemporary neuroscience is the attempt to sort of explain one within the other. And then the question is, well, how is that going? And I think it's sort of like a land of paradoxes. Like I think it is a place with massive epistemic, shifts and pits and traps, and it's very difficult to figure out. And there's probably a good reason for that, which is that science wasn't, at least in its initial design, really supposed to even be looking at that.
Yeah, well, let's turn to that. But before we do, I just want to add a couple things. The listeners may remember that I'm a big fan of Arcadia by Tom Stoppard. And Arcadia is really about the tension between the extrinsic and intrinsic perspective. I've never thought about it. And of course, written in the 20th century, I think, or 20th, not early 21st. Arcadia is in a world, it has two different time zones, present and past. But in the present part of it, it's a time when the extrinsic perspective has dominated the intrinsic perspective, right? The success of science has emboldened it so dramatically that the humanists, the specialists in the intrinsic perspective, or on the run. They have the intellectual low ground. They don't get the big grants. They don't get the prestige. And, maybe at some time maybe in Galileo's time, it was like half and half. Now it's more like 90-10. And in the world we live in. I also want to reference, the conversation I did with Ian McGilchrist, which is also his book, The Master and His Emissary, or The Master and His Emissary. I think it's The Master and His Emissary, is trying to explain this historically, that as we've emphasized, he doesn't call it this, but your term, the extrinsic perspective, it has taken up more and more of the oxygen in the room and more of the bandwidth. And I think that's the world we live in right now. And I see your book in some sense reclaiming, not in the sense that you're an advocate for the humanities, but reclaiming the importance of each perspective and the respect we should have for both of them.
Yeah, and that's something that came out of really realizing how difficult it's been for science to explain human consciousness. And I don't just say this as a layman and an author. I was, I have a PhD in neuroscience from, I worked at probably the top lab in the United States for trying to understand the neural basis of consciousness, and my conclusion from about 15 years in the field is that we're no closer today than sort of when I entered the field in terms of understanding it. And this is a pattern that repeats in neuroscience a lot. I just saw a very interesting paper I think yesterday, that someone shared on Twitter, actually, about how cancer survival rates have been going down slowly but cancer survival rates have been increasing, slowly but gradually, as as scientific investigations into cancer have been making incremental progress. So there hasn't been any major breakthroughs in cancer research, but your chances of dying from cancer are much better than they were even 15 or 20 years ago. There is not really an incremental understanding of the brain that we can point to that neuroscience has been consistently generating. It's sort of a field of boom and bust narratives. And your listeners might remember some of them, right? Things like, there was, we in the early 2000s, there was mirror neurons, right? So mirror neurons were going to be this massive explanatory thing. You had really famous names writing about how this was going to unlock the key of understanding what made human beings special. And if you go back and you actually look at what happened with these hypotheses, they mostly kind of just fall apart and complexify to the point of explaining nothing. And I refer to neuroscience as sort of a land of like dead narratives, right? It's just this new thing comes in, and it could be a methodology like brain imaging or so on. And if I'm not talking here, just to clarify, because there is sort of this response, which is that, well, our understanding of how neurons work and molecular biology is much better now. So the aspects of neuroscience that deal with the individual like neurons of your brain, that aspect of neuroscience has sort of increased. We know much more about how neurons individually function. But realistically, that's almost never what anyone wants explained, by neuroscience, right? Like we want the big picture. We want to understand, how does thought occur? How does cognition occur? How does consciousness occur? And these are things that, if there's one story of neuroscience over the last 20 years, it's just that, wow, the brain is really more complex than we thought. And that's basically, I hate to say it, but that's basically it. I've asked people to try to explain what is, the major advancement of neuroscience in the past 20 years. And there are some that I myself could put forward, but they're, again, like figuring out that the brain gets washed with cerebrospinal fluid when you sleep. I think that that's really important. But there's no real serious progress on sort of the questions that motivate people to become neuroscientists to begin with most of the time. And a big part of that is because I think there's a strong claim that neuroscience is the most difficult field in all of science, because it's the field where you have to put back in the intrinsic perspective and it meets the extrinsic one. And we can sort of bracket aside, all of these other qualities in every other, area of life, but you can't really do it in the brain because there is a fundamental truth about that people have a stream of consciousness and they're experiencing things. And we want some sort of explanation of how and why that's occurring and under what sort of laws, are experiences related to neural events. And the simple truth is that does not exist in the field.
The way I think about it, and tell me if you think this is a good way to say it, our knowledge of the physical universe we live in has grown. Our knowledge has grown continually, with some, of course, a few steps back, but many more steps forward, since in the last 500 years, 400, depending on when you want to start. And we learn more and more. We know more about cancer, not enough that we can avoid it, but we know more. We know more about the universe. We know more about all of our body. We know more about geology. We know more about everything. Economics is a separate question, by the way. I once heard Robert Skidelsky say it's not a progressive field. He didn't mean ideologically. He meant we don't make any progress. that it's more like neuroscience, maybe. But basically, we learn more and more. And we're the only part of the universe that, as far as we know, has any thoughts about it. We wonder about why it's here, and we learn more and more about it. But the only part of that universe that we don't make much progress on is the piece that we use to understand the universe. That is our brain. And that's awkward. And you could say, well, but it's just such a small part. And yet it is incredibly ironic to me that the part that's doing all the work is the least understood part. And that is disturbing. It is deeply troubling. It is thought-provoking.
Yeah, and you know what? That view. So the view that I sort of land on, in the book is something I call scientific incompleteness, and the idea is that maybe science really is fundamentally incomplete. Like there really are some things that can't be known. And it's precisely because of this troubling aspect, as you put it, that the very system that's trying to figure it out suddenly needs to sort of include itself in the calculation. And actually, I think possibly the first person in history, as far as I can tell, to make this argument was Friedrich Hayek, who wrote a little known book in 1952 called The Sensory Order. And it's Hayek's take on psychology. And he seems to sort of imply this. And I actually have a quote here. So he says, "Mind must remain forever a realm of its own, which we can only know through directly experiencing it, but which we shall never be able to fully explain or reduce to something else." And he sort of lays out his reasoning clearer in a different paper, where he says, "Any apparatus for mechanical classification of objects will be able to sort out such objects only with regard to a number of properties which must be smaller than the relevant properties which it itself must possess." Or to put differently, an apparatus for classifying according to mechanical complexity must always be of greater complexity than the object it classifies. And he says, if so, then the mind can be interpreted as a classifying machine, which would imply that the mind can never classify and therefore never explain another mind of the same degree of complexity. And I thought that that's a very interesting thesis. I don't know if I don't think that it's like the best or like the most accurate way to sort of put it, but it was very interesting to find, to sort of do the research and try to find the earliest instances of people really talking with this language, and really like putting their finger on the problem. And I think Hayek might actually be the first.
Now, I assume that people in the rest of your community or the neuroscience community would say, well, okay, not right now, right? Yeah. But just give us, it's only a matter of time. And I think that, by the way, is an unbelievably common view of everything. You're talking about scientific incompleteness. Most people would say, and certainly most amateurs, smart people who aren't scientists, they would say, oh, there's no such thing. Everything will fall before the power of the scientific method, and it's just a matter of time. Is that commonly said, and do you agree?
Well, it's probably commonly said. I think it's sort of it's sort of like already been proven wrong, in that we know, like, there are literally proofs in science itself, particularly within physics, that some physical properties are undecidable. Right. So, I won't go into like the deep details of some of these physical properties, but there's things like this question of what's, the spectral gap of any sort of of any sort of like physical material, which is this, particular physical quantity, and has been proven. It was proven in a Nature paper just like a couple of years ago that it's just an undecidable property. There's just no actual scientific answer to this frameable physical question, right? And it's due, by the way, to self-reference. It's because the people were sort of clever enough to figure out, and I can't speak to the exact details of how they did this, where they sort of got a spectral gap to like refer to another spectral gap, and it created this weird, paradoxical cycle of self-reference, because that's where almost all these sort of incomplete, undecidable results come from. They all come from self-reference. And so we know this for all sorts of things. I mean, the card game Magic the Gathering, right? There is no fundamental winning strategy to that card game because it's incomplete. It's provably incomplete. Like it's like it's undecidable what like the best move of Magic the Gathering is. And so if you think about it like that, if you think about, well, listen, we know that there is these, very simple systems where these paradoxes crop up. It would be relatively unsurprising to think, well, just when we just talk about reality as a whole, should we expect it to be paradoxical or non-paradoxical, right? When we talk about the system as a whole, right? And I think it's quite reasonable to say, well, we should really expect some paradoxes. And I think, the scientific reply to the physical properties being undecidable has so far been, well, those things don't really seem to matter that much. They just, the exact, you could sort of have other heuristics for calculating things like these undecidable properties, and they just don't really crop up so far in physics in ways that like we really care about. So it's fine. But I suspect that there's something really fundamental going on there when it comes to observers themselves, right? I mean, if you think about your what is the neuroscience of consciousness? It is an observer's attempt to explain themselves from within the system that they're existing, and that looks a lot like some sort of self-referential a problem, and in those instances of self-reference, it's very easy to get paradoxes, like the very famous liar's paradox of I am lying right now. Well, if I'm lying right now, I'm either telling the truth, in which case, wait a minute, I'm not lying, right? Or I am lying because I'm telling the truth, or I'm not telling the truth, right? But either way, there's no answerable conclusion from that, and these things are very easy to create. So I think just broadly, it would be incredibly surprising to me if something as complex as reality and science didn't have some weird paradoxical holes in it. We know that even mathematics does, and mathematics is one of the things we're like most sure about, in the world.
I'm going to read this passage. I don't 100% understand it from your book, but I love it. So you can say anything, you can add anything what you want to it. Then I'm going to find you a different one, a different example of this similar thing. You say, you're right, a metaphor. Imagine a perfect map of an island, and I do mean perfect, even though it need not be as large as the island. It's exactly to scale, such that every rock, tree, and even grain of sand is represented on the map in incredibly fine detail. Astounding, but still at first conceivable. Now imagine that the map is on the island itself. What happens? The observer is now in the observed. For if we think on that perfectly detailed map, we see that it must contain within it a map of the map. And that map must also be perfectly detailed and contain a further map of the map, an infinite recursion. And what is a brain, if not a map of the world? Like maps, brains represent the world around them, creating a world model. But the brain is part of the world. I love that. You can add anything you want to it. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but it's one of these self-referential paradoxes.
And you'll note, the broad takeaway from looking at paradoxes, and perhaps the most sort of famous and canonical is Gödel's proof, right? But if you look at them just broadly, right? So without sort of getting into their specifics, they are almost always based. In fact, as far as I can tell, they're essentially always based off of some sort of self-reference that gets introduced into the system by some sort of encoding. So in Gödel's proof, this is called Gödel numbering. In the case of the island in the map, that's when you place the map back on the island. And very broadly speaking, people don't conceptualize science as this sort of formal system. So I'm not saying it should necessarily be thought of as a formal system, but one could imagine thinking of science as sort of this big formal system that's sort of proceeding by these rules or laws of empiricism and sort of grinding out axiomatically to find the truth about the world. And if you conceptualize science that way, then you have to find a spot for the observer in there. And it seems very possible that when you do that, you are triggering some sort of deep recursion or self-reference. And we know that self-reference just destroys the epistemic purity of systems. I mean, you have to work very Bertrand Russell spent decades trying to figure out ways to get it so that mathematics would be sort of purified of self-reference, right? He was terrified of self-reference because he had come up with one of the first really concrete examples of the liar's paradox, which is in set theory. And it's, it considered the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, right? Does that set contain itself, right? And if it does, it doesn't. If it does, if it doesn't, it does, right? So he was terrified of this, and he had very good reason to believe so. And it's sort of funny when you think about neuroscience as a whole, the part that's, self-referential is our attempt to understand scientifically where consciousness comes from. Why is it that particular experiences are related to particular neural firings? And we're having so much trouble trying to figure that out. There is no sort of well-accepted leading scientific theory of consciousness that anyone can put forward. You can sort of put forward, maybe we know a bit about attention, or maybe we know something about how, concepts are manipulated in the brain or something. But fundamentally, if you just give, a neuroscientist the most detailed map of neural activity of a human brain you could, there is no theory they could apply to figure out exactly what that person is thinking or feeling or experiencing at that moment. They could throw some machine learning at it or something, but there's no formal theory the way that there are physical theories that tell us, we have the calculus that explains, how the leaf, falls, right? There is no equivalent of that in neuroscience that explains why it is that this particular neural dynamic would be associated with this particular experience. And we seem to just be having a huge amount of trouble in this very specific case of self-reference. So it makes me, very suspicious that maybe something is going on here.
I'm not sure the falling leaf's the best example because
yeah, there's a lot of complexity in there, isn't there?
Subject to air, currents, chaotic jostling, and so on. I'm going to read you. I think you'll like this if you don't know it. This is a short parable. Supposedly an Arabic tale. I've seen a version of it in the Talmud, but the most eloquent version of it is told by Somerset Maugham in a play that he wrote in 1933 called Sheppy. Now, this excerpt is Death narrating, Death speaking, okay? Mm. So this is a little monologue by Death. If you want, you can imagine it as a skull and or carrying a scythe and so on. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions. And in a little while, the servant came back, white and trembling, and said, "Master, just now when I was in the marketplace, I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned, I saw it was Death that jostled me. She looked at me and made a threatening gesture. 'Now lend me your horse and I will ride away from this city and avoid my fate. I will go to Samarra and there Death will not find me.' The merchant lent him his horse and the servant mounted it, and he dug his spurs in its flanks, and as fast as the horse could gallop, he went. Then the merchant went down to the marketplace and he saw me, Death. He saw me standing in the crowd and he came to me and he said, "Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?" "That was not a threatening gesture," I said. "It was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, where I had an appointment with him tonight in Samara." And of course, that's the paradox of free will, right? The servant thinks he's escaping death. Death knows the future, but the servant feels like he has free will. He doesn't realize that his attempt to escape his fate only fulfills it. And if he had stayed in Baghdad, maybe he wouldn't have died because that's what it looked for him in Samara. So anyway, I think our anxiety and uncertainty about free will, as you recognize in your book, is somehow tied into this self-referential challenge. I don't know how important it is. You can see it as much as well about whether these peculiarities of or holes in our knowledge of certain things that are caused by these paradoxes, whether that's important or not. But again, I come back to this point that our feeling about who we are seems, you'd want science to understand that a little bit, but it seems to be struggling.
Yeah, I would phrase it as there's almost a sense in which people have gotten over their skis, in that most of the arguments, say, against free will are very much assuming that we sort of will have this like a priori perfect, complete, understanding of the world, right? Like they'll start with something like there was actually a great case of this with Alex Garland, who did the TV show Devs. Alex Garland did. He also did Ex Machina, which was the sci-fi movie about the Turing test.
Great movie.
I really like his stuff. Yeah, he's a great director. But he has a TV show called Devs, and in it, the sort of the plot is around this quantum computer that can sort of perfectly predict the future, and people's people are going to have to sort of reconcile with the fact that it's very obvious that they don't have free will because they can see themselves doing things that they're going to do, and it's sort of this the psychology of it. So it's a great TV show. But if you actually think about the machine, right, that could somehow perfectly like model the world, and then it includes people's reactions to what they see on the machine. So therefore, the machine would need to have a perfect copy of itself, also sort of running in the background, generating the future that the people it's simulating are seeing. And then that machine would need to, right. So you get it, right? So you would immediately have this infinite regress of computation, for such a machine. So it's not even clear if that's a conceivable thing. It sounds like a conceivable thing, right? It sounds, sort of a priori obvious, but when you really start thinking about it, you're like, well, wait a minute, this machine seems like it really quickly jumps into a paradox of it would need somehow it would sort of need infinite computation, because it also needs to model what it's modeling in the future and how the other people are reacting to it and so on, in order to sort of predict the future correctly. And so oftentimes people will just assume, when they're talking about free will, oh, we have some sort of perfect, just imagine this perfect physical model of the universe and we just run it forward in time, and we see everything you're going to do and so on. And it's like, well, that's not even clear that that's really a logically fully definable thing. But because once you sort of look at that and make reactions off of that, you need some way to predict what the thing itself is going to do. And so again, you sort of end up in these paradoxical trips, these paradoxical traps. And I think that these crop up more than people realize. And that, we really shouldn't, until we really fully reconcile the extrinsic with the intrinsic, until we really do have a full understanding of how that's reconciled. I think it's just a bit too early to say something like, well, you don't have free will, or we can very clearly, we'd be able to predict your actions, ahead of time or something like that. It's like, well, but first you have to sort of complete science. You can't have an incomplete science as it currently stands. And maybe it's fundamentally incomplete anyways. So then you really can't ever complete it. But certainly, I don't think you could argue that it's completed now with the state of neuroscience being what it is and the difficulties that it has in explaining how we have experiences. Certainly, I don't think you can say that science is complete.
Well, it's not very different from, I knew you were very worried about AI, but one of the worries about AI is it'll, quote, figure everything out and then know exactly what you would do in different situations and be able to manipulate you. And I think that's, again, as I said back in 2014, when I talked to Nicholas Bostrom, that's the medieval view of God. God, as seen in many religions, is omnipotent, omniscient, knows everything that there is to know about the past, present, and the future. And I'm skeptical that a human being can create a system that could be omniscient. That computer that knows where every atom is at every point in time in the universe. Now, there's quantum arguments for why that's not possible. And then there's a debate about whether that really changes anything in terms of prediction and so on. But these recursive self-referential problems seem to me to be relevant.
Yeah, and there's actually, it's funny you mentioned that. There's a small section in the book about Boethius, who is a Roman consul and philosopher, and this is around the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Dark Ages, and he writes a really famous book, one of the best in medieval literature, called The Consolation of Philosophy, while he's awaiting his execution. And in it, he gives this argument about that maybe he's trying to figure out, can we still have free will with an omniscient God? And one of the things
problem.
Yeah, an old problem. And one of his ideas is that, well, God is sort of outside of time. So it's sort of a mistake to think that God is jumping ahead and seeing what happens, right? And then saying, okay, I can predict what you're going to do, because God sort of has to see everything that happens all at once. And so he's not really making this sort of the same sort of claim that you would make, that you're imagining you would make, right? If you could somehow see all of time, you wouldn't really make claims about, okay, I'm going to predict that this is going to happen, because everything is happening concurrently. But I think there's even, we know so much more now. There is this revolution in terms of understanding of chaos theory. And one of the big takeaways of chaos theory, and something that science as a whole still really hasn't dealt with, I think we're still figuring out exactly what this means and how to relate to it, is that there are some systems where there is no simplified model that you can use to really predict where they're going to be significantly far ahead of time in the future. This is why weather is famously unpredictable. And it just, no matter how good our science gets, our predictions of weather will never be as good as next year we know the temperature will exactly be this on this day. That is mathematically provably just impossible. Right. We know we cannot figure that out, because these tiny variations in the system, the only way you could figure it out would be if you sort of had, an exact duplicate. And so the easiest way to talk about this is in terms of programs. And so, one way to say this is that there are some programs that the only way to figure out what the program is going to do is to run it. You can't sort of look at it and cogitate ahead of time, okay, exactly what's going to be the outcome of this program. You just have to run the program and then see what happens. And this brings us to, the question of, well, what is our brain more like? Is it more like a program that you have to run it to figure out what it's going to do? Or is it like a program that you can sort of figure out ahead of time? And I think we probably have pretty good reasons to think that it's the sort of program that you have to run to figure out what it's going to do. But then you're in a very strange circumstance, right? Because all you're saying is, well, I can predict what you're going to do. But see, the way I'm going to do that is that I create a perfect duplicate of you. And then I watch that duplicate of you do stuff. And then I go back to you and I laugh and I say, haha, I know what you're going to do now, right? And it's like, well, is that even worth the word prediction anymore? Are you really predicting what I'm going to do? Right? It's sort of like this weird case of observation plus time travel. It's not really prediction in any fundamental sense. And you certainly couldn't predict what the instance you created of me was going to do. So it seems like, if we think about free will, it's sort of like all you did was sort of shunt the free will over to the first, clone, right? And, that clone is doing stuff that you never could have predicted. And now you're coming back here and telling me, I don't have free will. And it's, now I can just sort of, I don't know, be like a, say, well, I have an identity with the first clone, so and you couldn't know what I was going to do then, so I still have free will, and I don't think that modern understandings has really grappled with how deep the damage to prediction chaos theory has done, and how bled of any real substance the notion of prediction has become in these systems that are fundamentally chaotic.
Yeah, going back to economics now. It reminds me of the Lucas critique, which is basically saying that policymakers are fundamentally constrained by the fact that what they try to impose on the population has a reaction on their part that they can't always anticipate, and therefore they can't really get to the outcome they think they can get to. I'm not sure I said that right, but we'll put a link up to Lucas critique to get it fairly. But basically, to treat it fairly. But it's basically the idea that policymakers might think they have all the levers and dials of the economy, but inherently it's an inherently impossible thing. And I think the Austrian economics approach, which is Hayekian and Ludwig von Mises, are the main proponents of it, most famous proponents. What they're arguing is that the knowledge of ourselves is in our brains. It can't be written down, and it can't be put in a book. Meaning, if I asked you, if the price of such and such went up, how would you respond to it? Well, you don't know until you've experienced it. And what prices do is coordinate the information that we have about ourselves that gets produced through the experience of price changes. And that in turn leads to a price out in the world that sends signals to both producers and consumers. I didn't say that very well, but the best version of it is actually written by James Buchanan. They will put a link up to it as where he refers to what he calls the market process. It's not a set of mathematical equations that lets you predict what prices are going to be in advance, because the knowledge that you need to find those prices gets produced through the process of the change itself. And it's a little bit better. And that's very similar to your clone example and whether we could predict what a person's going to do. Well, we could, of course. It's like saying in economics, yeah, when we have the equations, now we don't have those until after the fact, but then we do have them. But then what's the point?
Yeah, precisely. And I think, even if you look at somebody like Stephen Wolfram, who wrote a book called The New Kind of Science, in which he talks about he really dives into these new notions of chaos theory and whether or not systems are sort of reducible, whether or not they're programs that you need to run to figure out what they're going to do, or whether or not you can sort of understand them ahead of time. He even, and this is, a physicist, talks about free will, in his book, where he says, this is a quote from him: "In traditional science, it has usually been assumed that if one can succeed in finding definite underlying rules for a system, then this means that ultimately there will always be an easy way to predict how the system will behave. But, now computational irreducibility, which is another term for this, leads to a much more fundamental problem with prediction, for it implies that even if in principle one has all the information one needs to work out how some particular system will behave, it will still take an irreducible amount of computational work to do this. In other words, if you had a perfect model, you would still have to run the model to figure out what's going to happen. And then we get into this weird state of, okay, so in what possible sense is this really the sense that people use the term prediction? And if someone says, oh yeah, physics can predict what you're going to do, and what they really mean is, well, if there was some sort of perfect clone of you in a different physical universe, and we sort of froze our universe in time, and we ran that other clone forward in time, saw what it was going to do, we could then return to our universe, and you would do the same things. And it's like, well, it's just not a notion of prediction that seems very strong. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with that. And I don't think that a lot of the arguments sort of against free will have really grappled with how the complexity theory has changed our understanding of complex systems and what it means to predict them.
Yeah, to me, it's like draw a map of the island, and when you draw the map, make sure you also draw the fact that the map is on the island while And then you say, well how would, and that can't be done. That can't be done. It means map within map within map within map. And although part of me says that's just a silly paradox, maybe it's not silly. Maybe there's a little more to it about how the world actually works. And maybe our brains can't master those things. I don't know. Let's close with William James's depression. That's a nice way to end. I think that for 3 years he had a little trouble getting out of bed and how he snapped out of it.
Yeah, William James was he was a young man at the time. I think he was bedridden for, I mean, not quite bedridden for 3 years, but he was in and out of this deep existential depression, and it was due because he found it completely inconceivable how anyone could have free will, and so he questioned his own will, his own purpose, his own meaning, and he. A lot of the work that he later did, like Varieties of Religious Experience, was all based off of his really deep depression that he suffered. And one day he basically just came to the realization that this is just impossible to solve. You can sort of marshal endless philosophical arguments one way or another. Now he didn't have the benefits of modern causation, our modern mathematical understanding of causation or chaos theory or any of these other things, right? So I think maybe we can actually go a little bit further than that. But he came to believe, listen, this is just impossible. And so if it's unanswerable, I'm just going to choose. Right. And he wrote in his diary, my first act of free will be to believe in free will. And he just sort of chooses, in a sense, to come out of this depression and get on with his life. And I think that, there's a lesson in that.
My guest today has been Erik Hoel. His book is
The World Behind the World:
Consciousness, Free Will, and the Limits of Science. Erik, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you so much, Russ. It's a pleasure to be on again.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.